So let me start by thanking the organizers for the invitation to this great conference. The topic I'm talking about today is about political connections or social connections more broadly and the implications for corporate governance. This issue of political connections has received a lot of attention in the academic literature over recent years, the last 2 decades, and for a large set of countries now, it has been documented that firms benefit from connections to politicians. So you can see on this map that for a large set of countries in Asia, Europe, and the Americas, there's evidence that having connections to politicians is valuable for firms. So the first paper that documented this was by Ray Fisman on Indonesia, where he documented that connections to politicians accounted for up to 23% of firms' market value. And even for the US, it has been documented that political connections account for up to 5% of firms' market value. When we talk about political connections, there are different varieties of how firms can be connected to politicians. In particular, in recent years in the US, a very popular topic is about campaign contributions, that firms contribute to politicians' campaign, and there's some suspicion that they might do so with the anticipation of receiving return favors from politicians. The other form of connections, firms can be connected to politicians through personal connections. This could be, for example, alumni networks, people who went to the same school, people who socialized together, for example, in a golf club. We could have geographical proximity, firms that are located in a politician's district and therefore have connections to this politician. Some politicians, think about the example of Donald Trump in the US now, they can be politicians and executives at the same time. Or we can have cases where politicians used to be working in firms and still have those corporate or executive networks when they go into politics. In the examples that I'm going to talk about today, it will be about personal connections, so alumni networks or people socializing regularly together. Now, when people think about why are those connections valuable to firms, what we mainly have in mind that those connections to politicians provide firms with better access to government resources. This can be things like government contracts, but it can also be things like receiving information about reforms and other things from politicians ahead of other firms, for example, or that firms don't have to comply with regulations. So the monitoring of political connected firms might be laxer, or you could think of things like if there's a tax audit for a company, maybe this information could be leaked to a connected company, also helping it to comply with the regulations. So what has been documented as sources of this increase in firm value because firms are connected to politicians are that politically connected firms, they seem to receive more financing from state banks, from government banks. Governments, they are more likely to pay subsidies to those connected firms or bail them out when they are in trouble. More government contracts are allocated to politically connected firms, and there's also evidence of this lax regulation, so that firms that are politically connected don't have to comply with all the regulations, so the monitoring is laxer. Now, why does all this happen? So there are several channels through which this might happen. One thing, it could be a very benevolent story, that those connections between people from the private sector, from businesses and politicians could actually make our systems more efficient. It could be by knowing each other, by interacting, there's an exchange of information. If you think, for example, about government contracts, maybe the politician is more aware of who is a capable CEO, so which firm will be effective in executing government contracts, and it could lead to a very efficient allocation of government contracts through an information channel or an enforcement channel, that the politician knows if I give a contract to my friend from university, I know I can trust him, that he will execute his contract well, or that he will not kind of try to cheat me and execute the contract well. But on the other hand, there are also concerns that we could have negative implications from those connections. Maybe people give contracts to connected firms just as a favor, even though they know that economically it's not efficient. They just give a favor to a friend so that this company can increase their sales and profits from executing those contracts. But from a social welfare perspective, it's actually inefficient. Okay. So why should we care about this? Why is this an important topic? If you just look at government contracts, so government procurement contracts that the government allocates to private firms, this accounts to more than 10% of GDP. typically 10 to 20% of GDP in developed countries. In developing countries, this share is even much higher than this. So based on what I mentioned before, given that this large share of resources allocated by the government, if those connections have a positive effect, maybe we should encourage meetings between business representatives and politicians to improve the information flow between the two. But on the other hand, if this leads to distortions and an inefficient allocation of resources, then we might be concerned and might have to think about mechanisms to prevent this form of crony capitalism or those kind of corrupt practices leading to inefficiencies. Okay. So what I'm going to present today are two examples. The first one is from Korea. This kind of covering the period when MB was in government in Korea on the allocation of government contracts and some evidence from the private sector, from the allocation of bank loans, and then moving on to an example from Germany about social clubs, about which I will be more specific later, which will have some direct lessons to how certain elements of what we can think of as governance can mitigate some of those negative effects of connections. Okay, so let's start with the Korean example. So while everybody in the room here is familiar with the election of Lee Myung-bak, so he came into power in Korea in 2008, and what I looked at in this paper is changes in government procurement contract allocation around this election. So the main findings in the paper are that firms that are connected to MB's networks, the networks that I will be looking at as graduates from Korea University Business School, and people who worked with him at Hyundai Engineering and Construction, they start to receive more contracts after MB was elected from the government. Those contracts that are allocated to those connected firms, so private firms that have a CEO connected to those networks, are executed inefficiently. So we see more problems with the execution of those contracts in terms of construction mistakes, delays of the construction, etc. So it's always hard to measure the magnitude of how costly those inefficiencies are, but a rough back-of-the-envelope calculation suggests that for every dollar of contracts allocated to connected firms, there's a cost of around 17 to 26 cents to the economy. So if you aggregate this, the annual cost to the Korean GDP is roughly 2.2 to 0.3% of Korean GDP from this inefficiency of contract allocation because of connections. So I mentioned this before. So whenever I will now call a firm as connected, this means it is a private firm that has a CEO either from Korea University Business School or a CEO who previously worked at Hyundai Engineering and Construction at the time of MB's election. Okay. So due to data restrictions, everything that I will talk about now is just about KOSPI listed firms. So it's about 630 KOSPI listed firms at the time of MB's election, and 59 were connected to those two networks. 40 had a CEO from Korea University, and 19 somebody who in the past worked at Hyundai Engineering and Construction. Okay, so that's the first thing that you can observe, is that when you looked on the day after MB won the nomination election of the GNP against Park Geun-hye, you see that stocks connected to MB, those are the black lines, they have a significantly higher return than firms that don't have a CEO from those networks. On the left-hand side, you see this for the day after the election, and on the right-hand side, the week after the election. So the black lines, those are the connected firms, so their return is significantly higher than for non-connected firms. In terms of the magnitude, it was about 2 percentage points on the day after MB was nominated by GNP as a candidate for the presidential election, and almost 4.5 percentage points in the week after, and the effect was quite a bit stronger for firms connected to the Hyundai Engineering and Construction network. Now, getting to the allocation of government contracts. What this graph shows is the annual volume of government contracts that connected firms, this is the black line again, and non-connected firms, the gray line, receive as a fraction of their total assets. And you can see while there's an increase over time in the volume of government contracts allocated in the economy, before MB is elected, firms that had a CEO from Korea University or Yandhi Engineering Construction, their contract volume grew at a very similar rate to firms that were not connected to those networks. So you can see this before the election. But starting from the year when MB came into the office, you start to see that suddenly firms connected to those networks, they start to experience a significantly higher growth in government contracts compared to those non-connected firms. Now, this alone does not tell us whether this is something that we should be concerned about. This could well be a very efficient story related to what I was mentioning in the beginning, that MB or the people who actually decided about the allocation of the contract might just know people from their alumni network better and therefore allocate contracts to people that they can trust or which they know that they are very capable. But it could also be the case that this is driven by favoritism, or we have cronyism, that they allocate contracts to connected firms, to their friends, even though it's economically inefficient. So what is interesting in Korea and kind of helps us to understand which mechanism is actually driving this increased allocation of contracts to connected firms is the system in Korea that a large set of those contracts are actually allocated by state firms. As the majority of you will know in this room, is that the president plays a very important role in deciding the CEOs of those state firms. So what you can observe in the data is that after MB came into power, when he started to appoint CEOs in those state firms, in a large set of those firms, he actually appointed people from Korea University or that had a background with Yandhi Engineering and Construction. So in many of those state firms, suddenly you have people from those two networks. Now, at the private firm level, well, we have those firms that are connected to the Korea University network and firms that are not connected. So we can now compare whether this allocation of contracts is really driven by connections by comparing whether those firms started to receive more contracts from those state firms where MB appointed somebody from the same network, or whether they received more contracts from all state firms. And what I observed or found in the data is that the reason that those private firms received more contracts was because MB started to appoint all those people from his networks. So for simplicity, this is just for Korea University here, but the same thing also holds true for Yandhi Engineering and Construction networks. So this appointment of state firm CEOs from those networks led to more contracts being allocated to private firms that had a CEO from the same network. Okay. So what is very interesting is there are some cases where MB appointed people from Korea University, but those state firms already had a CEO from Korea University before. This is interesting because it allows us to check whether this allocation of contracts to connected firms is simply because the state and private firm are connected, or whether the president is actually involved in this allocation. And the interesting thing is, so if we look at state firms where MB appointed somebody from Korea University, but they already had a CEO from Korea University before, those state firms already allocated more contracts to connected private firms even before the election. So after MB is elected, for those state firms, there's actually no change in contract allocation to those private firms. So this has some important lessons. The first thing that tells us is it's not really the president that is allocating those contracts to connected firms. So everything is happening at this stage between the state firm CEO and the private firm CEO. So those state firm CEOs, they allocate contracts to people from their networks. Something that I have been looking into in the last 2 weeks, which is not on the slide, you can even replace those people with people from Seoul National University, Yonsei University. They will also allocate contracts to their friends from the same university. So it's really not something specific about MB or this presidency or Korea University. If there are connections between the state firm and the private firm, we see increased contract allocation between those connected entities. So this strongly suggests that those personal connections play an important role in the allocation of contracts. Now, to get a sense at whether this actually led to an improvement in the allocation of contracts, made it more efficient or less efficient, what is very nice is this database in Korea. So all this data is actually available for free on the internet. So free to download and to look into. And for all the construction contracts, amendments to the contracts are listed. So you can actually observe for every contract whether there was a delay in the construction, whether there was a construction mistake, whether there was an increase in the cost of this contract that the government had to pay to the firm. So what I look at is to compare when a state firm where MB appoints a CEO from Korea University, for example, allocates more contracts to a private firm that has a CEO from the same network, do we actually start to see more or less of those negative outcomes like delays, cost increases, or construction mistakes? And what I find is that those connections actually lead to more of those negative events. So you see that contracts that are allocated to connected firms, they are more likely to exhibit delays, construction mistakes. It is more likely that the government ex post has to pay more for those contracts because costs increases. So this suggests that those connections lead to an inefficiency in contract allocation that is economically harmful. And again, the same thing, this is not just true for Korea University, you can replace that with any school network and you will find the same thing. So those connections seem to lead to a misallocation of contracts. Now, one thing I thought was very interesting is, well, it could still be the case that state firm CEOs, maybe they just allocate the very complicated and difficult projects to people that they know, because they know if something goes wrong, they can call their friend and make sure that problems are fixed. But this is not what is explaining the results. So they are even allocating more simple construction projects. So you can see there's a lot of variety from relatively simple projects to highly complicated projects. And despite the fact that they even allocate easier projects to connected firms, we still see more of those negative outcomes and negative events. Skip this. So to get a better understanding of where these inefficiencies come from, I try to understand whether the inefficiencies come from the initial contract allocation. So you could think about the state firm should decide to allocate the contract to the firm which it thinks is the most efficient firms in executing the contract. If the state firm, rather than allocating the contract to the most efficient firm, they give a favor to their friends, then this ex ante allocation of the contract is inefficient. They just allocate the contract to the wrong firm. Another potential story could be that maybe the ex ante allocation is not inefficient, but once the contract is allocated to a firm, maybe when the CEO of the state firm and the private firm are connected, they will just not push the private firm to finish the contract quickly, monitoring will be weaker. So it could be that the allocation of the contract itself is not inefficient, but the monitoring is not executed effectively. So to differentiate between those two, to give some guidance on the policy implications, I exploited the fact that in most cases, those state firms, the appointment cycles are that the president or the government appoints those state firms at a given date every year or every 2 years. So in most cases of those state firms, it's actually the third quarter of a given year. So there are some contracts which actually, there's a private firm with a CEO from Korea University, so he's connected to MB, but they receive a contract from a state firm still allocated by a CEO of a state firm that is not from Korea University. So there should be no distortion in the allocation of the contract because it was allocated by a non-connected CEO. But now when they start to actually build or execute the contract, they become connected to the state firm because MB now appoints a CEO from Korea University. And the interesting thing is, for those contracts, I don't find any of those inefficiencies in terms of delay and so on. So this suggests that the problem is not about the state firm not monitoring the private firm, but already in the initial allocation. So only if the contract is actually allocated by a connected state firm, those inefficiencies occur. So this suggests that to prevent this from occurring, the place to look is the contract allocation. So the allocation of contracts to connected firms leads to those inefficiencies. And while this is an example of Korea, so I thought this is kind of interesting for the audience here. If you look around the world, the involvement of the president or the government in appointing state firm CEOs is very prevalent. Of course, the degree to which the government can influence is different, but you can see in a large set of countries that the government is directly involved in appointing CEOs of state firms. Even for the US, there's a paper on connections of financial firms to Timothy Geithner after the financial crisis, who also argue that by having the power to appoint people in different committees, that financial firms that were connected to Geithner's network benefited from the fact that he could appoint people from those networks to different committees who would then, for example, decide over bailout funds. So this is not something specific to the Korean example. We can find this around the world, that this power of politicians to appoint people from their networks is relevant or prevalent. Okay. But this should not be confused with just a problem of the government sector. So still using the same example, I also looked at private firms. So at the finance industry. So the interesting thing that happened is that many of those financial groups in Korea, after MB was elected, they started to appoint people connected to MB's networks. So you can see a list of people here. For example, the member of MB's election campaign, people from Korea University, people from the same high school. So those financial firms, they started to actively build connection to the new administration. So they appointed people on their board or even as their CEO of some of the subsidiaries who were connected to Korea University. And the interesting thing then is, so this is the amount of bank loans relative to firms' assets that firms with a CEO from either Korea University, Hyundai Engineering and Construction, or any other CEO who's not connected to those two networks, that they receive in the time series. And you can now see that those firms connected to Korea University, they now start to receive more bank loans after the election. And this is not from government banks, so this is from those private banks. For firms connected to Hyundai Engineering and Construction, even though they are also politically connected to MB, we don't see anything similar. What is the difference between those two groups? Well, when we look at those financial groups, they only appointed people from Korea University. So it seems, even though this is the private sector, those firms also benefited from their connections to those financial groups. So those firms now started to receive more bank loans. So this is basically just showing the statistically. And if we look at the cost of those bank loans, so this is just a rough proxy because there's no direct data on interest rates. So it's basically the interest expenses from the income statement divided by the total debt. But even there you can see that the cost of debt, so the interest rates that firms from with a CEO from Korea University paid after MB was elected, started to decline after the election. So they became more credit at a cheaper price. Now, it's a bit hard here to do some similar analysis to try to understand whether this was an inefficient allocation of bank loans. So one thing that I try to look at is, in general, there should be a relationship between the riskiness of a loan and the interest rates that firm pay. So if you just estimate with, you can use different types of models, the probability that a firm defaults over the next 12 months, that should be reflected in the interest rate. So if it's more likely that the firm cannot repay a loan, the bank should charge a higher interest rate. And you can find a positive relationship between those two variables very persistently in the data. So this is true for firms that are not connected to any of the president's networks before and after the election. This is true for firms connected to Hyundai Engineering and Construction. So there's always a positive relationship between risk and the interest rate. But the interesting thing, for firms connected to Korea University, this relationship almost breaks down. So regardless of the riskiness, those firms now receive cheaper bank loans. And you can see that this is not related to information. So it could be the case that, well, because of those connections to those financial firms could better differentiate between good and bad borrowers or good and bad firms and charge lower interest rates to firms that they identify as good because of the additional information that they have. But this is not the case. So if you look at the distribution of interest rates, you find that for firms connected to the Korea University network, basically the entire mass shifts to the left to lower interest rates. So it's not that the banks use their information to identify good or bad firms, they just gave lower interest rates indiscriminately to everyone. Okay. So I think the main takeaways are that from this example is that connections can lead to a misallocation of contracts or in general resources, both in the government and the private sector. And given this large amount of resources that is allocated by the government, it's particularly problematic for the government, but also in private institutions, we can have this misallocation. So I will talk next about the German example, which has some direct implications about how can we actually mitigate those negative effects, but this already gives you a sense of the problem that occurs in a setting that is relevant for Korea. So now moving on to the German example. In the German example, we looked at, this is a paper together with Rainer Haselmann, who is a professor at Frankfurt University in Germany, and Vikrant Wick, a professor at London Business School, where we looked at social connections between firms and banks in social networks. So what are those social networks? In Germany, there's a very deep culture of those social networks that officially have the purpose to serve wider society. So they will give out scholarships, make donations, and they gather all local business leaders of small, medium-sized firms, politicians, or professional leaders, and typically those clubs, so they're called Rotary clubs, I don't know if you're familiar with this in Korea, they typically have what we can think of as a club banker. So in all of those clubs, there's at least, or in almost all of those clubs, there's at least one banker who is either the head of the local branch of a private bank or the head of a local savings bank, which is a state-owned bank. Okay? And those service clubs, they have a culture of mingling every week for either lunch, breakfast, or dinner. And those meetings are really mandatory. So this is not a very loose club where people go once in a while. If you miss more than 50% of the meeting over a 6-month period, you're expelled from the club. So those are really people that regularly interact socially. In general, everybody can become a member to this club, but it's highly selective. So you can think of this as really elite networks. You can only become a member if you're invited to the club and if every single member of the club accepts your application to the club. So you find in Germany the CEOs of companies like BMW, Siemens, who gather in this club. So it's really an elite network. In other countries, you might have country clubs in the US or golf clubs or this kind of thing. So in Germany, this is the most elite network that you have. So the data that we collected is from the membership register of those Rotary clubs. So we know all the members in Germany, which firm they work for, what is their role in the firm, and when they entered the club or exited the club. So we have more than 1,700 CEOs of mainly small and medium-sized companies who are in these clubs, together with a large number of those club bankers, so bankers from those local branches. And from the Bundesbank, so the German central bank, we have data on the bank loans that those firms receive. Okay. So the main question that we ask in this paper is whether those connections between those CEOs, those firms, and those bankers had an effect on the allocation of bank loans. So would bankers allocate more loans to firms that they're connected to in the club because they know the CEO? So if you just, as a representation of the entire sample, think about this as being a city where there are two clubs, so Club A and Club B. And so in Club A, we have a club banker, so this could be any local savings bank, for example, and we have a firm. So the question is now whether this firm 1 would borrow more from bank 1, where the banker is in the same club, compared to bank 2, where the banker is in a different club. And the same for firm 2, would firm 2 borrow more from bank 2, where the banker is in the same club, compared to bank 1 that is in a different club. So basically what we find, so when we look at when firms start to enter this club, is that they start to borrow more from this club banker. So on the y-axis, what you see is the share in loans coming from this club banker in the total borrowing of the firm. And you can see that this increases from around 12 percentage points before the firm, the CEO was member of the club, by almost 10 percentage points to 22% after the firm becomes a member in the club. Similarly, there's a very interesting feature in Germany. When somebody is elected as a mayor, they automatically become the head of the supervisory board of the local savings bank. So it happens that some of those CEOs, they sit together with somebody in the club, and at some point in time, this person is elected as a mayor. Once this person is elected as a mayor, this person now has control over the allocation of those state bank loans. So what we observe is once this person is elected as a mayor and becomes head of the supervisory board of the state bank, the CEOs in this club, now they start to receive more loans from the state bank. So again, this increases by almost 10 percentage points the share that they now borrow from the state bank. Okay. So similar as in the Korean example, what we wondered is whether this is, again, a story of a very efficient connection or network, that those people in this network, the banker might allocate loans to connected firms simply because he knows that he can trust them and they will not want to default on those banker that they have to meet every week in the club. Or whether this is actually a misallocation, that those banks start to allocate loans to connected firms, even though from a bank's perspective, the return on the loan is lower. So what we did is we simply compared the return on the loan that a bank makes for a loan allocated to a firm where the CEO is in the same club, compared to loans allocated to a firm where the CEO is in a different club. So the return from a bank's perspective. Okay. So just from the descriptive data, and actually the last two lines, they are flipped here. They should be the opposite. Without going through all the details, the most important numbers are at the very bottom, and you can see that when bankers give a loan to a firm within the same club, the return that the bank makes on the loan is just about 4 percentage points, but for loans made to outside firms, it's more than 8 percentage points. Okay. So we try to break this down. So the main information from this table, without going through the details, is that, well, this return on loan has several components. It could be that banks charge lower interest rates to their friends. It could be that when the firm defaults, they have a lower recovery. Or it could be that it's just more likely that the firm defaults when the bank is lending to a connected firm. And actually, the interesting thing that comes out is that for interest rates, we find some differences, but they are not even statistically different. We don't find big differences for recovery rates, but where we find big differences is the share of borrowing from the club bank when the firm defaults. And this is best summarized in this graph. So the numbers are small, so let me just explain the graphs. So at the right-hand side of the graph, this is when a firm defaults. And what you can see is in the quarters before the firm defaults, how does the share of borrowing from the club bank change? So in other words, if you look at the black line, when the firm approaches default, so starting from already 3 years before the firm defaults, you start to see that other banks, they stop lending to the firm, anticipating that the firm is in trouble. But the club banker actually keeps continuing to lend to the firm. So the share of the club banker keeps increasing. So when the firm actually defaults, there's a high exposure for the club banker. So in different words, the club banker doesn't provide loans at cheaper interest rates, but basically when his friend is facing trouble with his firm, he keeps continuing to lend to this firm, which then leads to lower loans from the perspective of the bank. Okay. So now I documented a lot of evidence from examples from Korea and Germany, suggesting that those connections have negative effects. Well, we all know maybe Korea is a particular example, but you can see here even for Germany that those connections are prevalent. So for many transactions, those connections are important. So this is something that we might potentially be concerned about. So now then the question is, what can we do about this, and is there some role for governance? So what we did in this paper is we tried to look at different kinds of ownership structures or incentive schemes or market structures that could mitigate those negative effects. So this is maybe in the frame of this conference kind of the most interesting evidence. So now the question is, what can be done to mitigate those negative effects of those connections? So I will not go through the details of the tables, I will just explain it in words what we found. So the first thing that we looked at is at state and private ownership. So in Germany, those state banks, they tend to have very weak incentive schemes. So whether your compensation of those bankers, whether or not they are promoted, is not tied to their performance, but it's mostly their seniority. So if you stay in the bank for a certain period of time, your wage will increase. At some point you get promoted unless you do something completely outrageous. So the consequences for a state banker of lending to his friends in the club when those loans default are relatively small. He will not have some negative consequences on his compensation or his career. In contrast, for private bankers, this is very different. So private bankers, they face the risk that they may be laid off by their bank, that their compensation is lower, that they are not promoted if their loan portfolio doesn't perform well. And the interesting thing that we find is that when we look at how much do those bankers lend to their friend in the club, the effect is more than twice as strong for state banks. So in state banks where the banker has weak incentives, he engages more in this costly, inefficient lending that is costly to the bank. In contrast, if you have private banks where incentives are stronger for the banker, where he bears some of this cost of inefficient lending, you see less than half of this lending to connected firms. The second thing that we looked at is kind of related to this idea, looking more directly at career concerns. So the idea is to exploit the age of a banker. So if you think about an old banker that is close to retirement, well, even though if inefficient activity in the club lending to friends has some negative effects on the performance, well, he's going to retire anyway in a year or two. So whether he's promoted or not, or in the worst case laid off, has a much weaker effect compared to maybe a young banker who still has a long career ahead of him. So if he would not be promoted or maybe be laid off by the bank, he would suffer for a shock to his entire future income. So exploiting this, we find that actually bankers that are younger in private banks, they also engage much less in this activity of lending to connected firms. So this is much more pronounced for older bankers, and interestingly in state banks where incentives are weak, both old and young bankers engage in this activity. But in private banks where incentives are stronger, in particular those young bankers, they're not engaging as much in this activity of lending to connected firms, suggesting that those incentives are a very strong force to mitigating those inefficiencies from contract or loan allocation to connected firms. The last thing that we looked at is about whether the structure of the market has an effect. So going back to Becker, the argument is if you have, so his argument was about discrimination, but you can apply this here as well if thinking about giving loans to your friends as positive discrimination. If there's any inefficiency from discrimination, competition should drive down those effects. If you're in a competitive market and you do something inefficient, you face the risk that your firm is wiped out. So competition in the market potentially might reduce inefficient activities. And what we find using different measures, one example would be the concentration of branches, how many bank branches there are in a certain region, or how competitive lending is, so how much it is concentrated with dispersed across many banks. We actually find that, again, the effect is less than half as strong if you have a more competitive banking market compared to uncompetitive markets. So not only the internal incentive structure through contracts, but also the structure of the market can have positive effects on reducing basically inefficient behavior, including this allocation of loans to connected firms. So this was for the how active they are, and maybe the easiest way to illustrate this is when we look at the returns on loans. So all the numbers here, they always compare the return on the loan that the bank makes by lending to a connected firm compared to a non-connected firm. So what the number in the first column means that when a state banker lends to a connected firm, the return on the loan is 6 percentage points lower than when he lends to non-connected firms. This goes to the extent that for state banks, they actually make negative returns on lending to connected firms. For private bankers, there's still a negative effect, but it's much smaller. So you can see the differential in the return for connected and non-connected loans is only about 2 percentage points. So this was another test that we did. If on top of the state banker being in the club, if the mayor is also in the club, so he's the head of the supervisory board, so basically there's no more monitoring of the state banker, plus this firm is now connected to 2 people, the effect is even stronger. So there's 9 percentage point lower return when the mayor is also in the club with the state banker, compared to just 5% if only the state banker is there. When the banker is older for every additional year of banker's age, this return differential is 13 basis points lower for private firms. So that means for every year that the banker has more in terms of his career perspective, the difference in the loan, so the lower return on loans that he makes in the club, decreases by 13 basis points. And finally, for competition, so you see in highly competitive banking markets, so with above median levels of competition, the differential is 2.5 percentage points. So there's still lower returns of connected loans, but if there's no competition in the banking market or very weak competition, this is almost 7 percentage points. So as a lesson for kind of what can we learn about governance, we always like to think about regulations or rules or governance codes, but what the lesson that we learned from this study is that a very effective method for reducing inefficiencies in terms of the governance of the firm is exposing the firm or the person in charge, in this case the banker, to competition or incentives. So on one hand, inside the firm, when you have incentive contracts, so the banker has some incentives in terms of his compensation or future career, or from outside, if you have competitive markets. So you could think of maybe in the Korean example, maybe if the CEO is also the owner of the firm, maybe the incentive is weaker because he will not face the risk of losing control of the firm or being laid off if he engages in inefficient activity. Or if you have large firms that control a market, so you have oligopolies or monopolies, then also this external pressure that could mitigate those negative effects might be weaker. Okay, so that was the presentation. Time for questions.
Thank you, David.